The check clattered onto the table as the owner, face contorted with anger, tossed some bills toward Ashley. "Get the check and get out," he spat. Everyone knew this client, Mrs. Flores, had to be treated with kid gloves. It was the same song and dance every time. Ashley tried to explain, to justify her actions, but the owner wouldn't listen. He pointed a finger at the door, silencing her. Ashley sighed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of disappointment. She left the office, her hopes crumbling like a sandcastle on a stormy beach. In another circumstance, she would have brushed it off, found a new job, and moved on. But her daughter's life hung in the balance, and she needed to work long hours and earn every penny. The owner would likely blacklist her, making it impossible to find work in any restaurant in the city. Waitressing was all she knew. If she hadn't quit college, if she had chosen a different path, she wouldn't be facing this humiliation. But things hadn't gone as planned. Ashley had excelled in school, easily securing a place in college. She lived modestly with her mother, content with her simple life. Then, in her second year, she met Frank. He was her classmate, a charming young man who swept her off her feet. They fell in love, and almost immediately, he proposed. Ashley was ecstatic. He was determined to marry her, and she was equally determined to say yes. She was already carrying his child, their daughter Molly, under her heart. Her mother, however, cried when she learned of their impending marriage. "Honey, why are you in such a hurry? No profession, no place to live. You should finish your education first, then start a family." "But we love each other, Mom. Everything will be fine. We'll cope," Ashley reassured her, but her mother's words echoed in her heart. Ashley couldn't continue her studies. Molly was barely 6 months old when she realized she was pregnant again. Frank, though he loved Ashley and Molly, was overwhelmed by the responsibility. He faded away, leaving Ashley to shoulder the burden alone. It all ended when Frank, unable to cope with the demands of adult life and the news of a second child, returned to his parents, leaving Ashley alone with a small child in her arms. Her mother, a nurse, helped as much as she could, but her modest salary barely covered their basic needs. A few months after giving birth to her son, Tommy, Ashley began looking for a job with a flexible schedule. Shift work as a waitress seemed like the perfect solution. Initially, a friend helped Ashley land a job at a cafe near her home. But soon, Ashley had to find another. The owner of the cafe began to flirt with her, making her uncomfortable, and she quit. Her next job was at a restaurant where the boss didn't harass her, but she was fined for every mistake, leaving her with barely enough to survive. Then, a stroke of luck. Ashley was hired at a reputable restaurant. She had a good salary, generous tips, and a strict but fair boss. There was one problem, though. Mrs. Flores, a grotesquely dressed, extravagantly jeweled, older woman with a notoriously bad temper. Mrs. Flores was a special client, and the boss demanded impeccable service, punishing even the slightest misstep. On Ashley's first day, she witnessed a confrontation between Mrs. Flores and another waitress. The woman was in a foul mood, nitpicking everything. The coffee was cold, the taste was wrong, and she even claimed to have found a hair in the saucer. The waitress was fired. "Why does she come here all the time?" Ashley had asked her coworkers. "Probably no one to pick on at home," one replied, rolling her eyes. "She seems to be related to the boss, so he bends over backward for her. We're the ones who suffer. Be careful, or you'll be next." At first, Ashley didn't understand. Then, she learned about the restaurant's unspoken custom. When Mrs. Flores arrived, the waiters drew straws to see who would serve her. It often ended in a severe reprimand, and 2 waitresses had already been fired because of her. No one wanted to endure that humiliation. Over the 3 years Ashley worked at the restaurant, she had a few brief encounters with Mrs. Flores, but she managed to avoid any serious accusations. Then, on that fateful day, just as Ashley was about to approach the boss with an urgent request, Mrs. Flores walked in, radiating negativity. Fate, it seemed, had dealt Ashley a cruel hand. She had to serve Mrs. Flores. Under the encouraging, yet apprehensive, gazes of her coworkers, Ashley forced a smile and approached the table. Mrs. Flores, true to form, began her tirade. She demanded to see a menu with calorie counts. Ashley, prepared for this request, complied. She then offered a taste of the dish of the day, but Mrs. Flores scoffed. I can choose what I want myself. I don't need your advice. Bring me a medium-rare steak, a Greek salad, and a latte with almond milk. Hurry up, I don't have much time. Ashley brought the drink with lightning speed and moved to take another order. But Mrs. Flores' voice, sharp as a knife, cut through the air. What's that? Is that almond milk? Hey, girl, I'm talking to you. Ashley turned to Mrs. Flores, bracing herself for a torrent of abuse. But before she could react, Mrs. Flores was already calling for the manager. The boss himself rushed to the table and immediately began fawning over the woman. He ordered Ashley to replace the drink and bring a special dessert as an apology. Ashley, desperate to appease the client, quickly carried out the orders. But it was no use. Get all these plates of garbage off my table, Mrs. Flores snapped, measuring Ashley with a contemptuous look. Ashley began to collect the dishes, carefully placing them on the tray. Just as she was about to leave, she stumbled, and some plates slipped from the tray, crashing to the floor. One of the plates struck Mrs. Flores' sleeve, staining her expensive suit. How dare you? Mrs. Flores shrieked. Are you trying to get back at me? You're fired. And I'll make sure you don't work anywhere, not even as a cleaner. The boss, alerted by the commotion, rushed over. He saw what had happened and immediately sent Ashley to his office while he dealt with Mrs. Flores. And that was how Ashley lost her job, the job that was vital to her daughter's survival. When Ashley returned home, her mother immediately sensed that something was wrong. Well, didn't it work out? She asked sympathetically. Worse, Ashley replied, her voice cracking with despair. I got fired. Because of that hysterical woman, Mrs. Flores. Remember I told you I should have hit her with the tray? They fired me anyway. Come on, honey, it's okay. We'll get through this. I'll do anything for Molly and you'll find a job. Don't worry. But Ashley's biggest worry was her little daughter's health. Molly had been born perfectly healthy and developed normally. But a few years ago, Ashley noticed that Molly had become pale and sometimes had bruises even after minor falls. One day, while playing at the park, Molly's nose started bleeding. Ashley panicked and rushed her to the doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: leukemia. The doctors, though, were optimistic. With expensive treatment, there was a good chance of recovery. But where could a nurse and a waitress find that kind of money? They refused to give up, contacting volunteer organizations, friends, and relatives, scraping together every penny they could. They managed to collect most of the money needed, but there was still a significant gap. Ashley decided to ask the restaurant owner for help. She knew the chances were slim, but she had to try. Her encounter with Mrs. Flores had made finding another job as a waitress impossible. Someone had filmed the incident with Mrs. Flores on their phone and posted it online. The video didn't show Mrs. Flores screaming accusations, only a clumsy waitress dropping dishes on an older woman. The video went viral, and that popularity worked against Ashley. Cafe and restaurant owners in the city saw the video, and even the lowest-grade eatery refused to hire her. She could only find work as a dishwasher and cleaner, often working at several places at once. She didn't lose wages, but she spent every waking moment working. Her mother took care of little Tommy while Molly underwent treatment. After 6 months, Molly's expensive treatment paid off, and she began to recover. Ashley worked tirelessly, but seeing Molly get better each day gave her strength. The difficulties seemed less daunting. She had to work hard to pay off the loan, but she and her mother were determined to overcome any obstacle. They supported each other, protecting each other from unnecessary troubles. Ashley tried to rest, to steal a few moments of peace. She often walked home after work. It was all she could afford. Spring had arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal. She dreamed that one day her life would change too. One evening, lost in her thoughts, Ashley walked past the restaurant she had been forced to leave in disgrace. She paused, a wave of bitterness washing over her. Then she noticed something sparkling in the grass. She bent down and saw a beautiful gold pendant adorned with precious stones. Ashley put the pendant in her pocket and hurried home. That evening, after putting the children to bed, she examined the jewelry. She sighed, knowing she would never be able to afford such a beautiful piece. She wouldn't keep something so expensive for herself. She thought about what to do with it. A pawn shop wouldn't pay much. Maybe some unfortunate old lady had lost it and was worried sick. Ashley decided to advertise it and find the owner. If they wanted to thank her, she wouldn't mind. But if not, that was fine too. Ashley posted information about the pendant in a special social networking group. Immediately, she began receiving calls from people claiming to be the owner, but none could describe the lost jewelry. Tired of the fruitless conversations, Ashley was about to remove the ad, but she didn't have time. The next woman who called turned out to be the owner. She described the pendant in detail, even mentioning that it could be opened to reveal a black and white photo and the inscription, "One life, one love, Charlotte and Benjamin." Ashley realized that the pendant truly belonged to the caller. She asked how she could return it, and the woman, tears in her voice, asked Ashley to drop it off at her house. She explained that she was sick and couldn't leave the house often. Ashley felt sorry for the elderly woman and agreed, even though she lived on the other side of the city. The neighborhood she was going to was considered prestigious, the house even more so. Ashley thought with annoyance that the owner of such a place could have hired someone to collect the pendant. She felt foolish for getting so involved. But that wasn't all. When the door opened, Ashley gasped. Standing before her was Mrs. Flores. She looked much more modest now in her homely attire. No jewelry, no haughty expression. But it was her. "Hello, my dear, come in," Mrs. Flores said, her voice excited. Ashley was uncomfortable. She had dragged herself all the way here for this woman. But she took a deep breath and, pulling the pendant from her pocket, handed it to the owner. Mrs. Flores kissed the pendant, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you, my dear. You have no idea what you've done for me. This pendant was a wedding present from my husband. He wasn't rich, and it took him a lot of trouble to get it. He died 9 years ago, and I'm living alone. This pendant means the world to me." Mrs. Flores invited Ashley to sit down and have coffee. As she gazed reverently at her pendant, she reminisced about her youth. Then, she suddenly perked up, remembering to thank Ashley. She offered her an expensive ring, taking it off her finger. Ashley refused. "I didn't do it for that." "Of course. KJ0PGT6QT4Gu6 but good deeds must be rewarded. And it will happen, believe me. Not by me, but by fate." She wanted to say more, but Ashley was tired of her supposed kindness. Apologizing, she said she had to go home. Mrs. Flores thanked Ashley again and offered to pay for a cab home. Ashley agreed and hurried away, secretly relieved that Mrs. Flores hadn't recognized her. She wasn't afraid of new reproaches. She would just be embarrassed for Mrs. Flores. Mrs. Flores was a kind woman in her home environment, but her grief over her late husband transformed her into a spiteful person when she was out in the world. Once in the cab, Ashley gradually calmed down and decided to forget this story and Mrs. Flores. She would never see this woman again, and she no longer held any anger towards her. She had many other things to worry about, so why waste energy on such trivialities? To Ashley's surprise, her life began to change rapidly after this incident. A couple of days later, she received a phone call from a well-known restaurant in the city, offering her a job as an administrator. Ashley was shocked. She had posted a resume for a waitress position, but the woman on the other end of the line explained that the manager liked her resume and decided that she was the best fit for the administrator position. Ashley could hardly believe her luck. She thought it was a mistake or a prank, but she decided to go for the interview. What if fate had finally smiled upon her? Arriving at the appointed time, she realized it wasn't a mistake. When she heard the salary, Ashley understood that fate was truly on her side. She wouldn't miss this opportunity. A few days later, she started work. She didn't have any experience, but she had worked as a waitress for a long time and knew what was expected of managers. Her quick mind, her observant nature, and her desire to succeed did the rest. She knew how to communicate, not just with customers, but also with employees. The management had no questions for her. Then, even more incredible events began to unfold. Unexpectedly, Ashley's ex-husband, Frank, reappeared. He had run away before the birth of their son, Tommy, and had remarried and disappeared. Even after learning about his daughter's illness, he hadn't shown up. His parents had helped them, providing some money for the treatment, but Ashley was still burdened by the debt. Now, suddenly, Frank appeared at her doorstep, bearing gifts for the children. With a penitent look, he apologized for his behavior. He tried to explain that he had to go to Mexico with his wife and couldn't visit his daughter. He said that after his wife cheated on him, he realized how wrong he had been about Ashley and his children. All right, Frank, that's enough. I'm not interested in all these details. Thanks for the gifts, but what do you want from me? Oh, come on, Ashley. I don't want anything. I just came to tell you that you don't need to pay back the debt to my parents. I'll pay it all back, and I'll pay alimony for all the years. Well, maybe not right away, but I will. Just please let me see my children. Frank, they're not your children, especially since they've already asked about their father many times. Ashley was relieved. Frank's parents' debt had been weighing heavily on her, so his offer to take care of it was welcome. The alimony would help close the loan. Resuming their relationship was out of the question. Her feelings for him were long gone, but his words eased the pain and resentment that had been tormenting her all those years. And Ashley's personal life was about to change in other ways. A handsome man, named Stanley, often came to lunch at the restaurant where Ashley worked. Ashley immediately noticed that he was paying attention to her. Though she was flattered, she knew her chances were slim. She was a divorced woman with 2 children. Who would want to take on the responsibility of another man's children who needed to be raised, fed, and clothed? No, Ashley knew that a man like Stanley wasn't for her. She was sure that, even if he liked her, as soon as he learned about her children, he would disappear. She decided to postpone her personal life until better times and tried to avoid Stanley. But apparently, Ashley had captured Stanley's heart. He decided to get acquainted with her outside of work. He approached her after work, introduced himself, and told her straight out that he wanted to get to know her. It must be silly to invite you to a restaurant, Stanley said with a smile. Ashley smiled back. Nice to meet you, Stanley, but I have to hurry home. My children are waiting for me. And how many do you have? Stanley asked with a sly squint, probably thinking she was joking. When he learned there were 2, he thought for a second, then laughed merrily. So that makes a difference. You're in restaurants almost every day, and they're probably much rarer. Why don't we all go out for dinner somewhere, or just take a walk in the park? Look how great the weather is. Ashley hadn't expected such a reaction. At first, she wanted to refuse, but then she thought about it and decided to agree. She had promised her children a trip to the park a long time ago. Ashley was amazed at how easy it was to communicate with Stanley. Not long ago, they didn't even know each other, and now she was ready to introduce him to her children and her mother. The most amazing thing was that he was ready for this acquaintance too. She suddenly thought that perhaps this was the love at first sight that so many talked about. And it was. She and Stanley fell in love and spent a lot of time together with the children. They got used to Stanley faster than their father, and even Ashley's mother approved of her daughter's choice. She realized that Stanley was a reliable man since he had formed such a connection with the children. She had never really liked Frank. 6 months later, Stanley proposed, and Ashley accepted with joy. The debts were paid, life was settled, and the young couple began to plan their wedding. They were successful and held a stable position in society. They decided not to save money on the wedding and to have a real celebration, the kind Ashley had dreamed of so long ago. Her first marriage, back when she was in college, had been messy and chaotic. This time, she wanted a beautiful wedding. Stanley agreed wholeheartedly. The wedding was magnificent. There were many guests, flowers, and gifts. Ashley, who had just overcome so much, had found her happiness. It had happened because of her resilience, her optimism, and, not least, the help of good people. Her mother was her biggest supporter, but as it turned out, she had other benefactors too. It became clear when Ashley received another gift. It was a small basket with live violets. At the bottom of the basket was a small box. Inside, Ashley found a beautiful pendant, exactly like the one she had returned to Mrs. Flores. A note was attached to the gift, in which the elderly woman sincerely congratulated the young couple and wished them many years of happiness and love. She wrote that the pendant was made to order, in memory of the very piece of jewelry Ashley had returned. It was surprising, but in keeping with Mrs. Flores' character. All this time, she hadn't made herself known, but she had recognized Ashley that day. Ashley had gotten her job as an administrator with the help of this influential older woman. She had been there all along, invisibly involved in Ashley's life, never losing sight of her. I must go to her and thank her, thought Ashley. Perhaps this unhappy, lonely woman, suffering after the death of her only love, was looking forward to seeing Ashley.